Okay, today we're going to discuss another super exciting study, this time in regards to the origin of terrestrial life on planet Earth. Or basically the idea of the history of life only on land. So how exactly did terrestrial life begin? And what were some of the first complex organisms that at some point came out of the water and started to settle on land? And normally when biologists discuss this, they usually focus on the big players. So in this case, things like plants, or as we've discussed somewhat recently, potentially types of organisms that used to be everywhere but no longer exist. Here I'm referring to very strange prototaxites. And this is something we've discussed recently and something you can learn about in the video in the description. But basically here the story was that approximately 470 million years ago, or possibly 500 million years ago, some of the first plants decided to colonize land and slowly settled on the surface. And so here for a very long time, biologists imagined this period as a kind of a somewhat bare, but also somewhat green landscape that contained a lot of first, but also somewhat tiny, green plants. Which was then followed by some of the first animals, very likely fish and certain types of arthropods, that started to spread from the seashore to land and eventually evolved the ability to walk. But that's the story we usually read in various textbooks, and that's what scientists assumed before. But the thing is, based on some of the recent evidence, including this major study you can find in the description below, a study from the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, that now basically suggests a lot of these previous assumptions seem to be missing a crucial chapter that might have been much longer than we ever imagined. And specifically here, for hundreds of millions of years before the first plant, or even before the formation of the first leaf, the land was already possibly transformed by a hidden kingdom that was genetically much closer to us, animals, than to plants. And here we're talking about fungi, or basically mushrooms. And so in this video we're going to briefly discuss how the fungi were probably some of the first engineers on the surface of the planet, and how they were most likely the original ecosystem that established everything else for plants and animals that arrived afterwards. And so here we're going to discuss some of these new discoveries that seem to push the history of fungi by approximately 1 billion years, and basically discuss how without them, complex life on land might have never even happened at all. But first, let's discuss the obvious. Why is this the first time we actually hear about this? Or at least I guess I hear about this. Well, in this case, this is really in regards to fossils and of course archaeology. One of the main reasons we've underestimated fungi is because they're absolutely horrible at leaving fossils. So unlike animals that usually contain a lot of bones, or plants that usually contain woody stems, a typical fungus is made out of soft, fleshy tissues that degrade extremely quickly. As a matter of fact, they actually degrade so quickly that it was only recently we've discovered that humans that lived thousands of years ago potentially used a lot more fungi than we imagined. And that was discovered by accident because certain teeth contained DNA that could have only come from fungus, implying that it was very likely consumed. Now, that's obviously not what we're talking about today, but the point is that fungi do not leave a lot of fossils. They do sometimes, but just extremely rarely. And that's of course because most fungal structures contain these thread-like hypha, which are normally microscopic in size, and first of all fall apart pretty quickly, but second of all can be confused with other microbes. So it's pretty easy to misidentify them. And because they don't generally produce any hard minerals, or contain any hard parts, they only enter the fossil record under very specific conditions. And for many decades in archaeology, when it comes to fungal history, there was always this gold standard. You can actually see a sample of this in this image. This is what's known as the Rhynie chert, an ancient rock that's approximately 400 million years old that was discovered in Scotland, and that surprisingly was able to somehow preserve a lot of these early fungi very well. Although in this case, it's actually fungi interacting with some of these earliest plants, which is possibly one of the main reasons why the fungi were able to fossilize as well. And so when it comes to fungi fossils, this is the only definitive fossil we have that suggests fungi existed on Earth 400 million years ago. But a lot of biologists believe there had to be more and possibly even older samples. And mostly because of a lot of different types of DNA analysis. Or basically when you try to compare DNA of various fungi, it does suggest that fungi diverged from a common fungi ancestor much earlier. In this case at least 1.2 to maybe 1.5 billion years ago. We'll come back to this particular concept in a few seconds. But here we even had some really unusual and somewhat controversial fossils, or technically somewhat controversial cryptic clues, from South Africa. Here, in a location referred to as the Ongiluk Formation, researchers discovered 2.4 billion-year-old basaltic rock that seemed to contain something resembling a fungal fossil as well. And if these are indeed fungi, it would mean they existed much before the atmosphere even had oxygen, and possibly in conditions on the planet that were extremely different from anything today. But after this discovery in 2017, there hasn't really been additional confirmation, and so we don't really know how accurate this is. Or in other words, at the moment biologists are not entirely certain what exactly this fossil is. So for all we know, it could actually be some kind of a different organism resembling a bacteria. But in 2019, there was a massive breakthrough. A breakthrough in regards to the timeline when it comes to mushrooms. And this time all of this came from the Canadian Arctic. And here this was a very unusual fossilized fungus referred to as Orasaphira giralde. And this one was preserved in a rock that was at least 1 billion years old. And so here we had a definitive proof that fungi seem to be present on land for at least twice as long as previously thought, and for at least twice as long as plants. And this was actually a game changer because it showed that fungi were likely already living on land, or at least in a shallow water, which is not something we knew before. But here the question was, okay, so can we actually fill the other gaps in the fossils? And can we find out how accurate this is? And when exactly fungi potentially started on land? And of course, what they were doing there. Well, this is where we have this new study from just a few weeks back. Now, once again, because mushrooms don't biomineralize very well, or basically, since they don't leave a lot of fossils, researchers have to rely on a molecular clock, which usually measures DNA mutations, to estimate when certain species diverged. This is, for example, how we know when humans appeared, and when humans diverged from cousins like the Neanderthals and Denisovans. And so basically here, by looking at DNA mutations, it's possible to estimate an overall timeline. And so here the team from Okinawa used a brilliant new method involving horizontal gene transfer, or basically when genes jump from one species to the other, instead of being passed down from parent to offspring. And in this case, by identifying 17 of these gene swaps, the team then established a kind of a rule of succession. If the gene jumped from lineage A to lineage B, lineage A must be older. And then they essentially did this for all of the known fungi species and tried to approximate the age of the oldest lineage, or basically the age of the oldest fungal gene. And so by using this particular molecular clock, they estimated that the common ancestor lived approximately 1.4 to maybe 0.9 billion years ago. So not as old as 2.4 billion years ago, but definitely much older than previous assumptions. This was during the so-called Proterozoic, representing one of the longest eons in terms of geological timescales. And though during this time most of the life known to us was largely aquatic, we also know that the surface contained one supercontinent referred to as Rodinia. But the atmosphere was generally oxygen poor, and intriguingly days here were approximately 18 to 19 hours long, not 24 like today. But previously it was assumed that the surface was mostly rocky and desert-like, and did not contain any complex life forms. As a matter of fact, this is also the period that's sometimes characterized as being the boring billion, because we don't usually find a lot of fossils around this time. But it looks like that assumption was possibly incorrect, because now we have at least several studies suggesting that fungi were probably already here and were probably doing something. And that's of course the next question. So what were they doing? What exactly were these ancient mushrooms doing on this barren planet? And in this case for at least 500 million years before the arrival of the first plants. Well, right now we think that they were basically preparing the stage, or preparing the meal for the rest of life that eventually settled on the planet. And that's because for billions of years, the terrestrial part of the planet, or basically the Earth's continents, were extremely bare and contained almost nothing except for rocks and shifting sand. So there was no soil, and there was nothing for life to live off. Yet here, ancient fungi, very likely in partnership with some of the primitive algae, eventually created the first true ecosystem on the surface. And so basically they became the ecosystem engineers. And so here, for millions and millions of years, they secreted powerful enzymes that eventually broke down a lot of solid rock and started to recycle nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, with this very long process eventually creating some of the first soils, and of course fundamentally altering the environment and possibly even the color of the planet. And so by the time the first plants were ready to move to the surface 500 million years ago, they did not come to the wasteland and instead landed in a world that was almost perfect for them because of these ancient fungi. And since the first plants did not even contain any true roots, they could only survive through the process known as mycorrhizal symbiosis, essentially a partnership between fungi and plants that helps them absorb nutrients from the soil. And this is of course something that a lot of plants, actually 80% of all plants, still rely on today. Basically, every major tree and every major plant that contains roots will usually contain a huge network of fungi inside of them, responsible for extracting a lot of stuff plants cannot do themselves. And as a return, fungi get a lot of different sugars and basically free energy from the plants that can photosynthesize. And so here this was possibly the formation of this ancient partnership, with fungi eventually becoming an important part of many different plants. But when it comes to fungi, there's actually something else that's kind of fascinating about them, and specifically when it comes to their evolution. Whenever our planet faces one of the global extinctions or global catastrophes, a lot of fungi tend to see this as a new opportunity. And so, for example, during the Permian-Triassic extinction 252 million years ago, which was one of the worst extinction events on the planet, here based on a lot of fossil records, we can actually see a massive fungal spike, as reported in this Berkeley study from 2011. And so following many different extinctions, fungi once again become the dominant life on the planet, mostly because there's a lot of dead matter for them to survive off, and they don't really need sunlight or even stable temperature conditions in order to survive. I mean, if you have mold in the house, you know how difficult it is to usually get rid of it. And well, mold is a fungus. So a lot of fungi, they basically thrive where no other life can survive. And we of course saw this again 66 million years ago when the asteroid killed the dinosaurs. As many forests perished, the entire world became a kind of a massive compost heap, which once again allowed fungi to flourish and allowed them to recycle a lot of matter, rebuilding the foundation for the new world. As a matter of fact, unlike animals and plants, and even unlike certain other organisms, a lot of the genetic data shows us that fungi tend to actually not even care about mass extinctions and do not suffer from them at all. I mean, obviously the mushrooms that were living under the asteroid impact most likely perished, but all of the other ones living elsewhere were totally fine. They regrew very fast and recolonized the planet within just years. And well, by itself, this definitely presents mushrooms or fungi in a completely different light. Or basically, they're not just decomposers and they're not just something you put in your omelette, but they're possibly some of the most important complex life on the entire planet, and very likely set the stage for everyone else to eventually start living on the surface. And though they do show up at the end of the life story, especially during the extinction events, they also seem to be the main architects that began everything on the surface. So basically all of the soil we rely on potentially came from these little guys. They enabled the evolution of plants, they allowed animal life to eventually settle on the surface, and they continuously survive every major disaster. And of course spoil our bread and make our bathrooms smell like mold. But that's a different story. They're still pretty cool though. And so trying to understand their evolution is not just some kind of a trip into the past, it's also a tool to help us understand what life needs to survive, or what we might even discover on some other planet somewhere out there when looking for some kind of a biosignature on a different planet. And so if we do find life on a rocky planet somewhere out there, it might not actually be green at all. Instead, it might contain certain chemical signatures produced by some kind of an alien fungus, as they're essentially transforming the surface just like they did on planet Earth. But in any case, this is definitely a somewhat intriguing study, and is definitely changing our perspective and the overall understanding of this boring billion that we previously knew very little about, and especially because fungi previously have always been a little bit underestimated. And so there's a very high chance that it was actually because of these little guys that the world became habitable. We'll definitely discuss them in some of the future videos, and so until then, check out the previous video on the proto-tag sites in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads, and can DM me directly, or by joining channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.